So I think it's safe to say, whether you view the Tunisian revolution as a success or a failure, and no matter how you view it, no matter why you would take one of those positions, we can agree that Tunisia is not out of the woods yet. Tunisia is still facing some major difficulties in social, economic, and political realms. I mean, you can absolutely see this. Right now, we know that Tunisia is the largest nation source of fighters for the Islamic State. And that's because of the massive problems, the massive social and economic problems within the country. So, what you've developed is two reform camps. Two camps advocating for two different styles of reform to try and ease Tunisia's ills. On one hand, you have a camp advocating for social and political reforms. On the other hand, you have a camp saying that if you want to make a strong country, you need a strong economy. And they're advocating for economic reforms. Josh, what do you think is the best approach?
I am in the economics camp. And it is my belief, and these are, and some articles support, that it's because of the national unemployment in Tanzania, which is the reason why it's the single largest source for Islamic fighters. Because it's in some parts of the country, it's either 15 or 30%, sometimes even higher in some parts of the country. Now that is massively horrible. That's just horrible. Even in America, the unemployment, even multiple, is low as like 5 or 6%. Even we're seeing that's affecting huge parts of the country because they can't find jobs. However, another thing that I particularly think is a major concern in economics is we have sunk over $1 billion into the Tanzania revenue. The African Development Bank and the World Bank has each sunk 500 million US dollars into the Tanzania revolution. The French Development Agency has sunk another 185 million euros into it, and the European Union sunk 90 million euros into this country, trying to make it better. Now, like I said, I'm a firm believer that you need a strong economy to be a successful nation. But there does come a point, in my opinion, when enough's enough. We have thrown mountain after mountain of money at it, and it has yet to go away. There comes a point when we should cut our losses and try and hope they either figure something out or we aid another thing which is a more likely chance of succeeding than the current government at hand. But some people say instead of doing something that drastic where we cut all ties and let it flounder in the ocean and die, they say we should focus on the social and political reforms, so that way when the economic reforms come, they're actually doing something to help the populace.
And I think you bring up a very good point. I myself, I know I'm firmly on the side of these social and political reformers. I really like this point that Chomiak brings up in her article in the Washington Post, 5 years after the Tunisian Revolution. She notes that this fixation on economic success has actually obscured the real impact of the Tunisian Revolution. The opening of the political and social sphere, the opening of freedom of speech and freedom of critique of the government in Tunisia. And I think that's a really important thing to know. I think the economic reforms are going to be necessary at some point. But I think you can't focus on the economic reforms at the expense of the social and political reforms within the country. If you're not improving people's lives and improving their general welfare, those economic reforms aren't going to do much. If you're not getting rid of corruption in the country, those economic gains, they're just going to line the pockets of the government officials and the already elites in Tunisia who've been oppressing the population.
I agree. But, and a point you made from Chomiak's article of the opening of the political sphere, allowing people to critique the government, which you say is an important social reform, I'm going to have to tend to disagree, though I do agree with it, but I do not believe it's important for a nation to focus on that in the beginning. Case in point, China. It is one of the last remaining communist countries in the world. And yet it is by far the most prosperous economic country at that as well. And the reason I bring this up is because in China, they have an actual banned list of topics where the average Chinese citizen cannot speak about in public. They may be able to whisper it in their homes, but they cannot talk about it in public. That is directly against your belief that political dissent or political critiquing is a factor of a successful nation. To me, is a direct example against it. Though there is a lot of problems with China, like overpopulation, overpollution, it is still, in terms of the economics, one of the best nations out there.
You know, I think you raise a really strong point by bringing in the People's Republic of China. That's hard for me to counter, but I do think I have some counterpoints I'd like to bring up of my own. And specifically, I think looking at Iran, pretty close in situation to Tunisia, I think Iran brings up a really good point. In Iran, the U.S. backed the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, for a number of years, after a 1953 coup all the way to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And what's very interesting in that country is the country was enormously wealthy because of their oil. And that wealth, that economic wealth from oil and trade with the U.S., was actually used to fund what the Shah called the White Revolution, a modernization of the country. But even though you had the economic reforms in the country and people became much wealthier, you still had a high level of oppression and government crackdowns on dissidents. And eventually, you had the Iranian Revolution, when the people, even though their incomes were going up, even though the economy was booming, came out to fight that oppression and demand social reform.
I'm not saying that you don't need political and social reform. I mean, I'm saying you do need that to be a good country. But in terms of being a successful and surviving nation in today's economy, you need economic reforms to help bolster your own people. In Tanzania, like I said, in Tanzania's case, they have 30% unemployment in some places. That's massive. And so they need to, I think, focus in on economics to keep them in the country. Because if they don't keep them in the country, what's the point of a political and social reforms if the people you're trying to do the reforms for aren't even in the country? So that's what I'm trying to say is, like, make sure they want to be in this country and then do the political and social reforms.
I think that raises a very good point. I look to a lot of historical examples. I have trouble arguing with China. China is definitely a good example. I look to a lot of historical examples from the juntas in Latin America to the Shah in Iran of economic reforms that weren't coupled with political reforms and social reforms and ultimately led to a downfall of a country. But perhaps the real key here is then to not diminish the role of either reform in a country's success.
No, like I said, that you need both. But in my opinion, to do an adequate justice to political and social reforms, you need to make sure the people you're doing them for are actually in the country. And since Tunisia is basically bleeding people due to the high unemployment in some areas, that's what they need to focus on, to make sure that the unemployment goes down and the economy goes up, making incentives for people to stay in the country.
And if you're going to make those economic reforms last in the long term, you're going to need to soon after follow with the political and social reforms.
That's what I'm saying, that you should focus in on the economics and then do it instead of doing social and political, because even though you're doing those and you're making lives better for those people in the country, what happens if they're not there to benefit from those reforms? Because the economy is just that bad.
Well, I think you raised some really good points. I think in this case, we can disagree on the relative importance, but both agree that in the end, you're going to need both types of reforms.
We disagree on which should happen first.
Exactly, but I think that's a fair point to disagree on. I think we've both proposed our moving forward plans in Tunisia, and I think in the end, you're going to find that they complement each other.
Yeah, that is true. It's just, we just differ on which step to take first.